Have you ever been lost in the wilderness, injured and miles from help? I have. I've been lost in the bush with no clear way out. I've broken my ankle miles from the nearest help.
I think I've severely done something to my ankle.
I've had my tent flooded, my gear wrecked, and I have hiked for 14 hours straight through weather so brutal we couldn't even stop to rest. These weren't just tough days, they were wake-up calls. But each one taught me invaluable lessons that could save you from making the same mistakes. Today, I am sharing 5 hard-earned lessons from the wild, so you can avoid these pitfalls, hike with confidence, and enjoy every adventure without the drama. You'll learn how to hike smarter, stay safer, and truly make the most of your time in the wilderness. Hey everyone, I'm Mauser and I've spent over 30 years hiking some of Tasmania's wildest, most remote trails. I've been caught out, I've made mistakes, and I have learned a lot the hard way. Now I'm here to help you learn the easy way. So, without further ado, let's just get straight into it. Lesson 1, the toughest day ever, 14 hours in brutal weather. Imagine stepping out into an exposed mountain range on a day when the weather seems to have a personal vendetta against you. Well, that's what one walk in Tasmania's southern ranges felt like a few years ago. Relentless wind and rain, with barely any shelter in sight, and freezing temperatures that make any pause feel like an invitation for the cold to settle right in. This was a 14-hour battle against the elements. Mud, exposed ridges and winds strong enough to knock you off your feet, literally. We literally got knocked off our feet quite a few times. At times, it felt like the landscape itself was against us. The lesson? Well, your clothing and mindset are your lifelines. Proper layering isn't just about staying warm, it's about controlling your body's ability to hold on to that warmth, even when the weather is trying to strip it away. You're not fighting the rain or the wind, you're fighting the cold creeping into your core. The right layers help you manage that, trapping enough heat to keep you going without overheating when you're working hard. And mentally, well, it's like running a marathon without knowing where the finish line is. Thinking about the entire distance can be overwhelming. Instead, what I did on that day, and it was a long day, was break it down into small, manageable goals. So I was aiming for that next ridge, or just another 15 minutes till I get to that next creek. It wasn't about conquering the whole mountain at once, it was about winning the next 5 meters. That's how you keep moving when everything in you wants to stop. So how can you apply this to your own adventures? Well, start by mastering your layering technique. Base layers to wick moisture away, insulating layers to trap the heat, and outer layers, your shell layer, to protect against wind and rain. Mentally, focus on small victories. Each step forward is a step closer to your goal. But mental toughness isn't just for the trail, it's just as important when things go wrong at camp. Because sometimes, even after a long, exhausting day, the real challenge hasn't even started yet. Lesson 2, the flooded tent disaster. So it was a hot summer's day and we just smashed out over 20 kilometers on the trail. We were tired, sweaty, and just ready to call it a day. And then we stumbled across what seemed like the absolutely perfect campsite. It was flat, open, dry ground with plenty of space to stretch out. It felt like we'd hit the jackpot. So we set up the tent, we started cooking some dinner and kicked back to relax, feeling pretty happy with ourselves. The sky was clear, the weather was still warm. What could possibly go wrong? Well, about an hour later, the sky flipped a switch on us. Out of nowhere, a torrential downpour hit us, not a light drizzle, like proper rain, the kind that soaks you in seconds. Within minutes, the ground beneath our tent turned into a shallow little lake, a little pond. Water seeped in from underneath, it soaked our gear, lots of it getting wet. We did manage to protect our sleeping bags, but pretty much all the other stuff was wet. And that's when it hit me. Our perfect little campsite wasn't perfect at all. We'd pitched right in a natural drainage area, a spot where all the water from higher ground wanted to go. The lesson? Well, always read the landscape before you set up camp. Don't just look for flat ground, look for clues. Is the area slightly lower than all of the surroundings? Are there any signs of previous water flow, like smooth channels or washed out patches? These days, I aim for slightly elevated ground with natural drainage. Even if the sky is crystal clear, like it was that day, I ask myself, where would the water go if it suddenly poured down? Because sometimes the skies can just open up from out of nowhere. And while staying one step ahead of the weather is important, it's not the only thing you need to be ready for. When you're out there, plans can change in an instant. Lesson 3, injury in a remote range, the unexpected exit. So with this next one, we were 6 days into a remote 10-day hike, deep in the wilderness with 2 other mates when one of them badly injured their knee. Not the kind of injury you can just walk off. It was serious enough that continuing the trip as planned was completely out of the question.
It's pretty bad, he can't walk. We're going to have to
take most of his load out of his pack, and get off the range. We think this is probably the best place to do it. Suddenly, everything has changed. We had to retreat off the range earlier than expected and find a safe spot to wait for a boat to pick us up in a few days' time. It was tough, not just physically, but mentally too. Plans we had spent weeks preparing were now out the window. Now it was all about managing the injury, staying calm, and adjusting to a situation we hadn't fully anticipated. Because here's the thing, the wilderness doesn't care about your itinerary at all. It doesn't care how far you've come, how much food you've rationed, or how keen you are to finish the hike. When something goes wrong, you've got to adapt, and often you've got to do it fast. So while we were waiting for the boat, it was a couple of days we had to wait there beside the lake, boredom started to creep in. Then I had this brilliant idea to use my Thermarest as a makeshift raft. So I paddled out onto the lake, feeling pretty pleased with myself, until I managed to fall off into the lake. And I think I was fully dressed too. Now, not only did I get soaked, but I also lost my prescription sunglasses. Gone. Just like that, somewhere at the bottom of the lake, there's a pair of glasses that'll never be found. That's the thing about the outdoors. You've got to be ready for all kinds of surprises. The lesson, always have a plan B and even a plan C. Carry extra food in case you get delayed. Know your exit points before you even start the hike. And make sure everyone in your group knows how to respond if something does go wrong. Flexibility and preparation aren't just nice to haves. They are survival tools, because sometimes, no matter how well you plan, the wilderness throws something at you that you never saw coming. And speaking of things you never saw coming, well, this next one really shocked me. Lesson 4, unexpected breakage. So one winter in central Tasmania, it was actually the first day of winter, we set out on what was supposed to be a relatively short day walk. It was one of those perfect days. It was crisp, it was clear skies, incredible views, and that satisfying feeling of just being out in the wild. Everything was going great until it wasn't. So we had summited, we'd climbed this peak, and I was stepping between some small boulders when my foot slips down in between the boulders, at which point I heard a sharp snapping sound. Now, for a moment, I wasn't sure. I thought, was that my leg or was that just a little stick cracking under the rocks? Is there a little stick tucked in under these very tightly packed rocks that I've somehow slid my foot in and snapped in half? Don't know. Whatever that sound was, it felt bad. My ankle felt bad. When I tried to stand, I couldn't really put any weight on it. And that's when the realization started to sink in that I had done something pretty serious to my ankle. Now, suddenly that magnificent day turned into a real problem. We were deep in the wilderness, we were miles from help, we're in freezing conditions with rough, rocky terrain ahead and not much daylight left either. That's when you realize just how vulnerable you really are out there.
The last hour and a half hobbling down the mountain with this crook ankle. It's pretty painful. Don't know what to make of it. Really bad sprain, or I'm sure I heard a big crack though, so.
And it made me sort of realise that being in the wilderness is a bit like a game of chess. You can plan 10 moves ahead, but all it takes is one expected move to throw everything off. That snap was my opponent's surprising little checkmate manoeuvre on me. Now, I did have a personal locator beacon with me, but after assessing the situation, I decided not to activate it as I believed I could get myself out without calling emergency services. And that decision itself came down to years of training as a guide and regular wilderness first aid courses. So I took some painkillers, found a large piece of wood to use as a makeshift walking stick, and started the hobbling out process. Crossing a long boulder field on one good leg, leaning heavily on that stick, every step was a battle between grit and pain. And at one point I remember thinking I really should have picked a straighter stick, but hey, beggars can't be choosers when all there are rocks and a few sticks. The big lesson here was always carry a basic first aid kit, but more importantly, know how to use it. Having the right gear is one thing, but it's the skills that make the real difference when things go wrong. And if you're heading into remote areas, don't leave without an emergency communication device like a personal locator beacon. Even if you don't end up using it, knowing it's there gives you options. But in the end, it's your training and decision making that really count. Because no matter how prepared you think you are, the wilderness has a way of throwing you curveballs. Sometimes it's an emergency and sometimes it's just a mistake you didn't see coming. Lesson 5, losing tent poles. So some lessons you only need to learn once. And trust me, losing your tent poles on the way to Australia's arguably hardest mountain, Federation Peak, is one of them. Now, back in the year 2000, on my second attempt at this peak, the weather was perfect, spirits were high, and we just smashed out an exhausting 8-hour push in brutal heat. Arriving at Stewart Saddle, an exposed campsite with jaw-dropping views, felt like the ultimate reward at the end of a long day. Then I turned around to notice my hiking buddy sitting there with his head in his hands. I asked him, "What's wrong?" And he looked up simply and said to me,
I don't have the tent poles. I don't know where they are.
For a moment it just didn't sink in, then the weight of it hit. No poles equals no setting up the tent, and that tent is our shelter for the night in this exposed campsite. And in a place like this, that's not just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. The landscape felt a lot less inviting and I felt a shiver go down my spine. Stewart Saddle isn't just a scenic spot, it's named after John Stewart, who died here of hypothermia in 1956. And it's a stark reminder of how unforgiving Tasmania's wilderness can be. We figured the tent poles had slipped from my mate's pack somewhere along the track earlier that day. Exhausted, he retraced our steps for about an hour before dark, while I stayed back, rigging up the tent using rope and guy lines. We made it through the night thanks to calm weather, but it was far from comfortable, and if the weather had gone bad, then who knows what would have happened. Every gust of wind felt like it could bring the whole little structure I'd put together down. The next morning we faced a tough call: press on without proper shelter or backtrack the entire previous day's hike. We chose safety, and after hours of retracing our steps, we found the poles right near the start of the previous day's walk. It was an absolute gut punch that sealed the fate of our trip. But a few months later, we went back and we finally summited Federation Peak. And the lesson here, well, always double check your gear before leaving camp. Do a quick check around the campsite to make sure nothing is left behind. And secure loose items onto your pack properly, especially critical ones like tent poles. And there's a general rule now, I never have ever put poles on the exterior of my pack. They always go inside my pack on every single trip. And also carry some lightweight cord, something that you can string together as a guy line, and plus know a few basic knots as well. A bit of paracord or rope and quick thinking can turn a disaster into just an uncomfortable night. And if you want to see some more lessons I've learned, this time from history's greatest explorers, then check out this video up here where I go through a few of those.